Full screen. I should introduce beyond. Hi, I'm John. Hi, I'm John Quinn, PhD, Director of Science and Product Development. My contact info is john.flowjo@bd.com. I'm in charge of, in part, setting the scientific program of what our softwares do. So if you've got requests for what you'd like to see included in FlowJo, included in BDRC, included in SeatGeek, I'm happy to hear. This is 10.9, released 5.5.23. Okay, so the primary things new to 10.9 are that we have some new compensation / panel design tools. A lot of research has been going on in improving compensation, and the current adds to this version of FlowJo is that we can do an additional bit of autofluorescence subtraction. We can do it via true zero. So you can do autofluorescence subtraction using autospill currently, and now you can also do it without using autospill if you prefer. And the cosine similarity score is just a statistic. It's just a measure that allows you to ascertain whether two dyes or floors, how similar they are. And then you try to avoid putting things that are extremely similar into a panel together. So those are built in now. We've included Marker Enrichment Modeling as a way to just automatically name clusters, as well as a few other functions. We've built in the ClusterExplorer. We tend to try to use our plugin architecture to find out what tools are useful that maybe seem like somebody will want them forever as opposed to transiently, and pick the ones that seem the most useful and build them in. ClusterExplorer has certainly passed that threshold. I feel like I will always be using that, or future builds of it to try to look at what's in my cluster. So that's in. There's a tool called the Embed algorithm that's intention is to forward propagate anything that you've produced via dimensionality reduction or clustering to future samples. So I feel like it's a super important tool. We've added a few extra gating tools, a new quad gate tool, actually a suite of quad gate tools, and also clone gates, something that anybody who's used version 9 of FlowJo might be familiar with as a way to synchronize gates within a sample. And then just for the purposes of putting this presentation into the form of a workflow, I'll just mention that there's amongst the new plugins that are out, there's something called CyCombine for normalization. And there's a tool called Tracking Responder Expansion, or TREX, that is nice for dim reduction, clustering, identifying differences between conditions. So I'll walk through as if we were going to use all of the new things that we've included as part of a high dimensional workflow. So it's useful to add in a couple things to do, something we didn't build in. Okay, so just quickly, CyCombine. So normalization, I feel like, is a really important, or potentially a really important aspect of a workflow. If we're going to do any comparisons across different experiments, whether it's time points or different cytometers and so forth, you'd like the axis values to line up, that negative falls at the same portion of the intensity scale, that positive falls into the same place. And for all the data collected at one time on one cytometer, this will be true, unless you've done something crazy. But beyond that, no, it may not be true unless you've worked really hard to make it the case. So I generally recommend to people to try to do everything they possibly can to avoid having to normalize. But sometimes, especially if you're working with, say, collaborators on different cytometers, normalization might be something that is absolutely required. We're trying to give you options. So, we've got CytoNorm up on the exchange. Here's another option for it that I think has actually been very popular within the Flow community, CyCombine. And so we're doing things where we're doing z-scores to see how close to some measure of central or average a given marker is, and using that as a factor, plus some clustering to do individual populations to identify it, and then doing just a standard approach called combat to do the normalization. So hopefully it's a more gentle approach that doesn't make your actual responses from population to population to population differ, and that we are doing that first z-score standardization. So we can try to avoid that. So if something really stands out as being different from the mean, then it is preserved. Okay, just a graph from the CyCombine paper where I'm showing you just what something looks like nicely normalized. Okay, next, the compensation controls. We've normalized, we're going to compensate. As I mentioned, there are two ways to do autofluorescence subtraction. Autofluorescence is the signal contributed by any cell that you blast with a laser. And sometimes it could be important to try to take out the autofluorescence, as the background can overwhelm some subtle populations. So autospill using linear regression allows you to do a linear regression of your negative, and then see any deviation from slope, and then subtract it, assuming that is contributed by autofluorescence. But if you want to go to a gate-based compensation, which people have been doing for quite a while, and so you might be very comfortable with that, we've added true zero as an option for what your negative might be when you put together positive and negative populations. So just FlowJo compensation wizard, this is just showing that there is an option that just says true zero right there for negative. So just as a reminder, when we are doing gate-based compensation, we're trying to identify in a positive gate and a negative gate, an example of cells that have bound a single color compensation control. So they should be positive for that one color and negative for all other colors that you might select. And so you can imagine that if we've got then an example of things that this tube just doesn't have, we want to subtract it down to a particular value. How do you know what that value is? Generally, it's background, which is why we come up with a negative population if you're on unstained controls and the unstained cells are your positive. That's where we need a true zero to have something to aim those at. And we can just work essentially with the assumption that any signal we're getting contributed is pretty much autofluorescence, that everything else is negligible compared to the contribution of autofluorescence in your unstained controls. And so that's a way that you can do autofluorescence subtraction. And then just an example from an experiment done by one of my colleagues here at BD, just showing you've got some HEC293 cells that have really high autofluorescence. The top row shows what happens if we remove the autofluorescence, which is we can resolve a GFP positive population that appears after GFP fusion. And you can't really resolve it if you have not removed the autofluorescence because the background comes way up. So if you set your gates based on what looks like a single background positive population, you lose that response. So just a slide trying to indicate when you might want to use some kind of autofluorescence extraction. Caveats: autofluorescence is different from cell type to cell type to cell type. You would want an example for each kind of cell. We will do it as a parameter and extract it like a parameter. And so you could use more than one at a time, but just remember that the autofluorescence you're measuring is for whatever cells you were showing us in that example. Okay, and then the cosine similarity score, once we complete that matrix, there is just one other option in your list of information that you may want to display about a compensation matrix. So CSM, cosine similarity matrix, shows you a grid of every pair of colors. And so right on the diagonal, you'll see a bright orange color that indicates a 1.0 score, indicating two things are exactly identical because you're comparing that thing to itself. And then away from the diagonal, fingers crossed, generally lighter colors, and you want to try to avoid using things that are darker. You can get the numbers out of this as well. There's a couple different representations of how you might want to look at it. I kind of like the stylized one for a PowerPoint. Use the one that's going to be most helpful to you. But it tends to be, just as a rule of thumb, people are trying to avoid things that creep over 0.9. I think experimentation showed some 0.91, 0.92, 0.93s are maybe passable, but in general, if you couldn't get a lower score, that's better. This is like a 10 color panel or so, where I think almost all the indications are pretty nice, except for packed blue and PE, it looks like. All right, moving on and looking at the chat. So I don't see any questions yet, so I'm plowing ahead on the slides. Okay, just mentioning T-Rex briefly. I think it's a really nice tool. It comes out of the Irish lab. Searbrun's the first author. That's the paper and the reference there up on the right. Tracking responders expanding imagines that what you're going to have are two conditions in your FCS file. And you might get those two conditions by perhaps concatenating a file together. So you've got some cells that are healthy, some that are diseased, treated, untreated, whatever it might be. You'll just need a pair of categorical variables. And what this tool is going to do then is create a dimensionality reduction, TSNE, UMAP, take a pick, and say, where on this map do we see a difference in how many events come from one condition or the other, as annotated by your keywords. And then we'll cluster. We'll use the places where it's different as a locus point, like a center of my clusters. We'll generally over cluster and then just pick the clusters that correspond to the most intense locus points. We've got strong over-representation of one or the other population, denoted by the keywords. So that's the plan for T-Rex. It's essentially a workflow that combines a bunch of the high dimensional things that we do normally, and kind of gets you right to the point of what's different between these two conditions, which is what we use all our statistics to do. So this is just an example of some work that I was doing where I was trying to tell apart a couple of different kinds of leukemia. So here I used a UMAP. I'm going to show you an example in a few minutes that uses a t-SNE, just to emphasize that either one is fine. These are pretty different samples. There were quite a few spots that were either a dark red or a lighter red, indicating that data were much more prevalent from the CLL samples that I combined into this data file, or dark blue and light blue, depending on how much more prevalent the ACLL samples were. You can see then that we produced a number of clusters that were based on the spaces that were different. So a very dramatic example here, where a lot of things were very different between the two. Okay, just a bit of the UI shown up here. We'll actually go through this where you pick what your different categories are, which reagents you want to look at, which parameters, a few settings for your clustering, a few settings for your UMAP, and so forth. So I'd like that tool, get you right to it. And then it'll be a nice tool to demonstrate on, if we've got clustering results, some of the other things we've built in. So built-in ClusterExplorer, just right up in the population span, just a button for ClusterExplorer if you've used it before as a plugin. It's got something like 95% of the functionality. There's a couple of buttons we haven't built in yet. We will, but it just gives you the ability to look at your clusters. So they're from the previous slide, and then also show bar charts, line charts, and heat maps of them. And it's all interactive. You can click on a cluster or a line in the heat map, etc., anywhere, and see that cluster pop up across the different plots. And then my favorite feature perhaps is that if you've got some categories on this data, you can switch between the two. Like I've got a gate showing ACLL and CLL, and say which clusters are more prevalent. Show me the indicators or statistics on each one of those clusters, separated by whatever categorical data that there is. So that is the built-in ClusterExplorer. Moving on then, which pairs really nicely with MEM, Marker Enrichment Modeling. There's another tool that comes out of the Irish lab. I love this idea. The idea is that when we finish clustering, we're frequently handed cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, a bunch of relatively meaningless names for clusters, and you could spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out what are these. And perhaps even more importantly, you might spend that time trying to figure out what they are, to give it a text-based biological name. You might want to call it, naive T cells, something like that, naive CD8 T cells. And we may agree on exactly what makes something match whatever that name is that we've given it to a certain number of parameters. But as you get to the 10th or 11th or 12th or 25th or 30th parameter that describes a population, what are the odds that your short name has done that appropriately, and that we agree on what the expression of all those markers are for that given population? And so the idea is, why don't we not do that at all? Why don't we give population names automatically that can be calculated, that are just how much more does this population express each marker, and start with the ones that are much more expressed, the most important differences at the beginning, and tell me how much more or less they're expressed compared to some reference that makes sense. And there's a place where you can select what the reference is. I think some obvious choices would be some control, some population that we expect to be negative for everything, or unstained, or whatever it might be, or all of the other clusters. If you're trying to figure out for a clustering result what's most important, I think comparing a cluster versus all of the rest of the clusters is a nice way to emphasize, well, what made this cluster special? What caused an algorithm to isolate these cells and say, well, they should stand alone as a separate population? So anyway, the way that the MEM score is produced, the pretty simple equation right there, just magnitude of the test sample versus minus the magnitude of the reference is an absolute value. Magnitude here, we're going to use median fluorescent intensity. The rest there is basically a correction factor, the interquartile range of reference divided by test. And so if one population is really spread wide versus the other being tight and narrow, that's meaningful. If they're equally spread, then that -1 cancels out, and that term has no effect. There is one just correction factor for if the IRQ of test goes to something very, very, very little, so that term would blow up. We just set a minimum threshold for what that number is. It's just like 0.5. Well, you can control that as well. So anyway, and then a reference MEM score could be positive or negative. We're just calculating magnitude here. If your reference is a bunch of unstained cells with essentially zero fluorescence, you always get positive numbers. If it's not, if it's all the other clusters, and some of the other clusters are much more positive than the cluster you're looking at, on some given marker, you might have a negative MEM score. This is actually underexpressed compared to everything else in my sample. So that is what MEM is, and we can just automatically generate the names with the click of a button right now in FlowJo, and it has some extra actionality built in around it. I think it's a really nice tool, and one of my favorite add-ins. Here it is in action. I highlighted a bunch of clusters. I click the Mend button. My clusters of names. So you can see, for example, the very first one is CD5 plus 3, CD45 plus 2, etc. So the most important factor on cluster 1 compared to all the other clusters is it has a bunch more CD5. And you can scroll through and see, okay, so CD4 is actually super intense for CD5. That's a plus 9. That is one of the most dramatic responses. So maybe that's a cluster of particular importance. You can set the threshold for what number do I want to see. Maybe all these plus 1s aren't super interesting to me, and I could have trimmed it. It has to be at least a plus 2. Up to you. We give you some options and some thresholds to tune on. How are we doing time-wise? Not bad. Okay. So here's just setting a different threshold. You can see that there's a handful of these clusters that on compared on average didn't exceed, more than a magnitude of 2 difference. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. The plus minus 2 is, we should probably, I guess, maybe make the plus go away if it's negative. So yeah, sorry. Good question. Okay. And then the last thing that you can do with MEM that I want to point out here, and I'll show you also that, is that you can choose to merge clusters based on MEM score. So if you end up with some clustering algorithm that's perhaps over clustered your data, and there's a lot of tools actually intentionally will over cluster as a particular approach to say, let's not miss any differences between the data. Imagine then also that your flow data has a much greater range than a MEM score. MEM score will reduce everything to minus 10 to plus 10, and your flow data has actually got 262, 144 bins typically. So there might be some variability built in with even an identical set of MEM scores. So this is a tool that you could say, please combine things. So you can see here's one where I ran it, and it's saying, okay, so clusters 2, 6, 8, 9, 11, 15, 16, 23, etc. all have pretty much the same CD5, down, CD38 up with a certain amount, minus 3 plus 2, etc. Let's make that one cluster and move on. It does it as Booleans, so it always keeps the original clusters. If you choose to not use the merge, fine, you've still got the originals, you'll never lose anything. But then you've got a Boolean that combines them, and then you get a little annotation that says cluster not merged for anything that wasn't merged at all. So if you want to then create, say, another overlay or graphic that shows all the ones that are in your final output, including merging, it's easy to figure out what's what. Okay, so Embed, perhaps my favorite tool amongst the new ones that we've put out. So here's all these tools that we intend for you to use to explore your data and come up with interesting and amazing things. Like here's a bunch of things I've learned on this data. How do you carry that forward? How do you apply what you've learned to the next data set? And that's where we want Embed to be used. So it's a measure of calculating either a dimensionality reduction or a cluster value for new data based on an existing result that you've got on some previous data that is directly comparable. And so we want this to be a way that you can stop having to concatenate everything that you need to compare together, and having done all the data first before you do any analysis, that you can learn something on your pilot experiment and forward propagate it to everything else going forward. We're going to do nearest neighbor embedding. Anyway, I'll show a picture of that on the next slide as a basis for figuring out how do we figure out what a proper t-SNE parameter or UMAP parameter or cluster number is going to be. And we intend to patent this. So it's it's filed and it's patent pending. So I think this is a cool new thing. Okay. Here we go. This is Embed. And so in the input space, so the input space is the things you've measured. This is your CD3, CD4, or CD8 kind of stuff. You'll have 2 data sets, one that you did in the past, one that you've just done now. And you want to learn from what happened in the past and apply it to what you've just done now. So we're going to figure out the nearest neighbors for every given cell in your new set. So that's this orange dot, this orange cell here. We say, what are the closest cells, based on the measures that we actually have physically done, the 3, 4, 8. Okay, so those are the 3 closest ones. And we can also figure out exactly how close. We can weight how important it is. So perhaps NN1 is the one that we weight the most, NN2 the next most, NN3 is the next most after that. You have some tunables in the tool itself to say how many nearest neighbors do you want to use. More gives you a more average representation of a cell. Fewer makes the closest neighbor even more important. And so I think we've set 5 as the default now, but still playing around with exactly what the best default is. It's something relatively small, something like that. We then move over to the output space, the dimensionality reduced space, or maybe this is the cluster number. And we say, okay, let's find out what, say, the t-SNE score of these 3 cells are. Take the weighted average of that by using interpolation and make that the t-SNE value for this new cell. And thus we could put that orange cell now on the t-SNE plot with the blue cells, the ones that were previously done, that you looked at and you said, I like this experiment, it tells me something, I've learned something. And so now we can use this new experiment, the orange cell, and we can put it in the proper context to evaluate and compare to the previous experiment that we ran. Okay. Additionally, we're going to calculate 2 different quality scores on embedding. So the input and output quality are the 2 things that I'm showing on these graphs here. So that is the average normalized distance of the nearest neighbors to the original dimensions, which all that means is that imagine you've done another experiment and a novel cell shows up, and there really aren't any nearest neighbors. Like, we'll still tell you what the 3 closest cells are, but you would like to see that it's actually a really big number, that this cell is really far away from everything that was in the previous experiment. So you could use that information then to exclude the cell that's got a very large input quality number. Like, it's very bad. It doesn't really fit into this model. You're going to get a poor fit of it. You could also gate on that number and use that to say, well, here's my novel populations. Tell me more about them. What is their profile? What's the MEM score of them? Something to that effect. Output quality is the same, but now using whatever your output dimensions are, like your t-SNE or UMAP or something like that. So did we find some nearest neighbors and somehow the cell ended very far away from them, in the output space, which would indicate that, again, you probably had something that didn't have a very good representation. There wasn't a good exemplar in the original data set. So anyway, just showing that this is a gateable, tunable tool that you can use as you will to improve the quality or identify novel or interesting subsets. Okay, and here's just the UI on Embed. It's built in, click the Embed button. Essentially, all of this fairly large UI just says, pick the output parameters that you would like to produce. So here I'm showing you using UMAP. Pick the input parameters that are going to be common on your data files. So that does not necessarily have to be all of the parameters. So you can imagine if you did a 20 color experiment and you switch 2 of the colors, you could use the other 18 to figure out what's your nearest neighbor. We're not trying to calculate these input values. We're just trying to say what cell is the most similar. So if you've got a subset of parameters that are the same, that can be used to try to identify what is the most similar cell to get a nearest neighbor to produce a t-SNE or a UMAP score. I think that's pretty interesting. I think that makes this tool very flexible. Anyway, you produce an embed node on the on the file that you've calculated on, and then you can just drag and drop that to some other file and say, create me whatever parameters I'm looking for. Of some importance, if you pick a clustering parameter out of here, we'll try to detect and say, okay, that's a clustering parameter, but there's just a right-click option on that allows you to say it's a clustering parameter. And that's important because what we want to do for clustering is basically vote as opposed to average. We don't want to create some kind of average or interpolated value of a cluster. You can imagine if there's a cell that its nearest neighbors come from cluster 1, cluster 1, cluster 1, cluster 1, cluster 1, cluster 1, and cluster 2. We don't want the output to be 1.1. We'd like it to say, yeah, it's cluster 1. It's 9 out of 10 neighbors ended up in cluster 1. It must be a cluster 1. There's one other button here that says, where is it? Oh, I might have taken the screenshot before I added in. There's a force cluster result to be used. If we end up with a situation where there is in a voting situation where clustering is being done, where there is no one cluster that gets a plurality of the other cells. So you've got cluster 1, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 2, cluster 3, cluster 3. How do we know what to put that in? We don't. We just give it a -1 value for the cluster, unless you check the force it into a cluster button, and then we'll pick the one with the most votes. Okay. So just an example here of the previous data where we took in some ACLL, some CLL files. We took an exemplar where the differences are showing up between the two of CLL versus ACLL and red versus blue. You get a new file. We map that new file's data to produce UMAP scores on the same T-Rex UMAP score and go, okay, so if there's a lot of cells right here, and then a few cells in the combined not so different populations, and maybe this is one of my ACL files. And you've got a way to compare it and start making judgments like that. Okay. Last few slides, a couple additional gating tools. We've got a suite of quad tools up here in the tools band under Booleans that say if you've got a couple of range gates, you can just click a button and we'll turn them into quads. If you want to have the valley between two peaks, like I don't know why I'm drawing with my hands, I have an example right here, to be used as the intersection point. We can also pick two parameters, find the two valley points, and draw either a straight line or curly quad if you choose to make a curly quad button. So fast way to make curly quads. There's also an option here that if you want to just turn these into a rectangular gate, you can do so as well. And then clone gates. So version 9 had a tool called clone gates that allows you to take a gate that appeared on multiple divisions of a hierarchy. So here I'm just showing interfering gamma positive being identified on 4s and 8s and say, I would like to make that a clone. So if you move the interfering gamma gate on CD4s, it also moves on CD8s or anywhere else in that particular gating hierarchy that you have a population with that same name that you've selected, and get the little clone icon next to it. And it's just a drop down right click, clone gates. Pair that with the synchronize function. That is a group option. So you double click on your group, check the synchronize button so that gates will synchronize across samples. And now if you can do that also within one sample, and you can, if you want, have everything automatically updated if you move one gate within a sample, across samples, etc. Okay. That's the end of the slides. I still see just the one question. I think we answered it, but yeah, sorry. Everything's called plus, and then we add on a negative. Sorry with mem scores. Clean that up a little bit. Any other questions before we move into demo? Awesome. Demo time. Okay, I've got two workspaces up, as one of the things I'd like to show is really compensation related, and the other is clustering and gating related. So let's start with the compensation stuff first. Okay, loaded in some comp controls. Particularly, it is spectral data off of one of the BD machines. I can hit the compensate wizard. If it's spectral, it shows you all the different detectors and says, I don't know that this is spectral, so tell me which detectors to use. You'll generally pick all of them if it is spectral. They choose selected parameters. Okay, it'll do its thing. It'll try to pair up what parameter goes with what single stain control. I can say remove the unused. That's okay to have more detectors than I have parameters, as I typically will the case in spectral. If I want it to be spectral comp, I can check the button. These tools aren't exclusively for spectral, but autofluorescence subtraction is much more appropriate, I think, if you're using the full spectrum of the unstained. You can do cosine similarity even if it's not spectral. Okay, so here I would then, if I'm going to do autofluorescence subtraction, like to dedicate a parameter to autofluorescence. So I'm going to pick something that I believe will have a lot of signal on the unstained, a lot of just autofluorescence. Let's go BUV496. Add that blank space where I can assign my unstained control to that. Okay, so we are identifying just basically what's in the unstained and saying, okay, that's my positive. And then let's go here and say true 0 is going to be what I use as a negative. All right, good to go. So we will hit view matrix. And there is our matrix. All right. Here is our channel dedicated to autofluorescence subtraction. You will sometimes see relatively large numbers in the autofluorescence subtraction channel, and that you don't have a lot of signal. So even a very large number multiplied by a very small number, you still get a fairly small number. We can look at, actually we picked out already, our fully stained sample, pick the cleaned up gate. That looks okay. So there it is with autofluorescence subtraction added. And then if we want to see the cosine similarity matrix, there's the CSM. I can display as a table. So there are our values that we can look for things like, okay, do any of these go over 0.9? Okay, no, we're probably okay to work with all of these colors together. Could I see it a little bit more visually? There is the one that I showed in the PowerPoint. All right. So there is autofluorescence subtraction and cosine similarity matrix. And time-wise, we are doing well. Okay, no questions in the chat. I think that was relatively straightforward, so I'm going to move on. And just minimize that. Okay, so over here now, I've set up a situation where I had some original files where I had, simple example, no stimulation on some, stimulation on others, and they're paired by patient. So I took the patient one files and I concatenated them so that I would have stimulated and unstimulated in one sample. So I concatenated. There is, I should show this, there is a choice if you concatenate. So I had done something like this, hit the lin negative population to do some cleanup gating here, where I had a dump gate involved. Export / concatenate includes the ability, if you're concatenating, to, as an additional parameter, choose some keyword. So I chose, stim as the keyword, which now I realized is the same as the plus minus thing. So the stim value is unstim or no stim for this particular file. The other one is stim, but it comes together and then it gives me that as a category that I can gate on in my compensated file, on my concatenated file. So I might show whenever stim went. No, maybe it's just in this file sample ID. I probably didn't call it anything fancy then that time. So here we go. We got the two samples and they're separated, the unstim and the stim. And then we can make gates on anything that's categorical like this, or actually anything that's really a histogram that has distinct peaks by just going to histogram, right clicking, saying create gates on peaks, and we auto get that stuff. There you go. I should have made that one a little bit wider. Okay, and I actually have those already in there under stim and unstim, so we're good to go. That's these two populations. I then ran T-Rex on it. Showed you how T-Rex works. Theoretically, the gist here is that it has created a couple of, I used t-SNE parameters, so T-Rex t-SNE 1 and 2. So I've got my islands in the data. It's also created a parameter called T-Rex % change, and it goes from blue to red. And so the populations that are most represented in one of the two conditions, so the stimulated ones were over here, as I said, unstim was the beginning condition and stim was the latter. Oh, I can actually show you the T-Rex interface real quick. Why don't we do that? We've got a little time. I still have like 20 minutes here. Workspace plugins and T-Rex. The interface looks like this, where you'll, not a surprise, pick which parameters you're interested in, pick your pre-treatment. And so I would say unstim, your post-treatment, stim. It doesn't, pre and post-treatment doesn't really matter. It was just the text we used for the two things you're going to compare. Some tunables for the clustering, some configuration available for how much over or under representation do you want to divide your data into to find stuff interesting. So anything with 5% of the events or 5 to 15% go in one category. Big wide middle, we don't care about a 15 to 85%. So even more closer to even distribution, and then a 95 to 100 at the top end, and an 85 to 95 here. Do you want to use UMAP or t-SNE, and some tunables for UMAP or t-SNE down below. Cancel. You get these parameters that pop up. Okay, including T-Rex clusters, which are listed here. Okay, and then in the layout editor, I just went in and dragged a couple of these things in to say something like, okay, here is my my dimensionality reduction of all of this data. I can see that I've got some islands. A few of them stand out based on particular markers. This big island here, which didn't show a whole lot of, is just highly represented by unstim, are my CD14 positives, negative for pretty much everything else. They got a little HLADR on them. And then the population down here and over here that really did show a big difference are, let's see, things that are perhaps a little TNF positive, IL-6 perhaps. They also have some HLA-DR, some IL-1B. The little population there stood out as CD123 and HLA-DR, again, different. So anyway, and then the populations here, the clusters, I just dropped into an overlay, and you can see highlighting the ones that have either mostly cells from one or the other treatment. So this big blue island here is that light blue one. You get a separate cluster as the thing that sticks out here, a few different smaller clusters for this group that were overexpressed in the more stimulated file, and then one more over here in the more stimulated. ignoring all of this, which had cell representation from both stim and unstim. So it isn't really super interesting for differentiating qualities. Okay, so that's just T-Rex has been run just so that I can show you that I have clusters that I would like to make sense of. Like, what are these clusters? And so why don't we throw some mem at this? I will highlight all of my clusters. Reading the question in the chat, my Spanish is meh. I'm going to say the question is, can I use more than 2 categories for T-Rex? And the answer is no. It is just specifically set up to do a 2-category comparison, so we don't have to deal with multiple comparisons tests. Sorry. Feature request for the future. Okay, so I'm going to highlight all of my clusters, and I'm going to say mem this up. Create mem scores and rename the nodes. I get the choice here for which parameters do I care about, and so I might deselect the viability die. Yeah, they're all going to be live. I've gated out the dead in that cleanup step. Get rid of the dump channel. These are all my already medley negatives. I think everything else is interesting. Let's keep them all. Here is what should the reference be? Do I want to do a user-defined reference? Do I want to do referenceless mem, which essentially takes the full range of the data and says if it's towards the left, it's like a 0. If it's towards the right, it's a 10 kind of stuff. Okay, possible. I do feel like picking a specific reference is really the power of this tool. So I kind of like the other two, and specifically MEM's auto reference tool, which means if you've got clustering results, we use the rest of the clusters and say, if I'm looking to give cluster 1 a name, then I use 2 to 385. There's obviously not all the examples are present there for T-Rex. It over clustered and picked out the ones that actually were in those like edge categories, and says, okay, so 2 to 385 are the things that we're going to combine into a population and say, how does 1 differentiate from all the rest of these? And then we'll go to 2 and say 1, 3 versus 1, 3, 4, 5, and all that stuff. So I like the auto reference. I'm going to pick that now. This is just that safety catch-all for the divide by the difference in interquartile range, so we don't make sure that blows up and goes to infinity. And here's so how big does the number have to be for me to consider it interesting? Let's go with 2. So I've got wiggle room to go down if I want. Here's the reference to the paper that was originally came out of the Irish lab, and I'll say okay. And there you go. That's fast. All right. So that cluster 1, really high on CD14, high on HLA-DR, not quite as high. And so I like the 1 to 10 gradation. There's a lot of auto naming tools that will give you the plus minus, or you positive or negative for marker, and that's that. I feel like you lose a little bit of information if you simply go plus minus. I like having some gradation here. And so it also gives you an idea like, okay, so both, or all of clusters 1, 2, 3 had more CD14 than the average cluster. So the rest of them down here are going to be a little lower in the CD14 scale, but 3 is a +7 and cluster 1 is a +6. So there's going to be a lot more. Okay, so there's that. There's a handful of these clusters that really didn't stand out for any given parameter more than than +2. Okay, what if I want to now change that threshold? Go back to mem and rename the mem nodes and say, okay, maybe I'll use a 1. I do that, and all of a sudden a whole bunch more parameters pop up in those names, because a lot of things express a parameter a tiny bit more than average. And so a lot of +1s appeared. I think maybe I liked the 2 better. Stick with the simpler names. You might want to know all of that information, up to you. For the purposes of today, I will go with the slightly simpler names. And then the last tool there is merge nodes on mem scores. So this will pop up. What we're going to do is look at each of the different parameters, and we'll say, what is the maximum difference for a given parameter between 2 different clusters that we'll accept? So if this one is HLAR, on CD14 +6, if I leave this as 1, and the next cluster could be a 5, it could be a 7, but if it's bigger than that, they're different clusters. And we'll look at every single one of the parameters and make sure nothing is outside of that threshold and merge them if they meet that criteria. We give you the ability to go 0 to 5. I really think 0 or 1 are probably the only choices that you want to use. It seems 0, like that doesn't make sense. Why would you get things that have the exact same mem score? Again, remember, flow data can be on a giant range of like 262, 144 distinct values. If we're some reason that into like a 1 to 10 scale, there's some room for variability within a given number. So I think if you go more than one, you probably end up merging all your clusters into one big cluster, maybe two big clusters. I think you lose your differentiation if you go more than that. I'll go 0. We'll see that little not merged appears next to each one of the clusters that were unique. Like that one's unique. You want to show that one all by itself in your final results. And at the bottom, we've got a handful of Booleans where 2, 12, and 17, they're functionally the same. 5 and 7 functionally the same, 13, 18, and then 14 and 21 functionally the same. Okay. So that is the variety of mem scores that one might use there. And then these are just populations in FlowJo. So if you want to, create some kind of, we do at this point, when we rename a population, we destroy your graph because the populations that when the graph no longer exists, you will have to drag things back into the layout hour editor. My apologies. Sorry about that. But it is just a matter of then saying, we put these back in. So I might do that one. I might specifically go in and highlight all the ones that say not merged. And then I'll drag in the ones that were merged via the Booleans at the bottom. Not merged, not merged. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so there's my slightly simpler plot where a handful of things that became a merged population, such as we would see the ones at the top. This green guy here was, I'll assume since it was 3 things, that were, it was just 2, 14 and 21, that one of those little dots and the other one were 2 separate clusters, and now they're 1. So generally it's a pretty small one. This gray thing used to be 2 separate clusters, now they're merged. They were functionally the same. So that kind of makes sense in that they're right there together on the plot, isolated from everything else. And I guess the other one's the tan one, so it's this right here. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, let's see. 14 minutes or so left. Let us show you how Embed works. All right, I'm going to go to all samples I hear so that I can, so we have a question. So is the mem score based on the overall MFI of the marker? So mem plus 10, it would be brighter versus mem plus 1. And so great question. Remember that the mem score is dependent on your choice of reference. So yeah, mem plus 10 is brighter compared to the reference than a mem plus 1. So for CD14, for example, if you have a mem plus 10, that meant it was like way brighter on a scale, on a normalized scale, than whatever the reference was. And so if your reference is like unstained cells, that could just mean it's super bright. If your reference, I guess it would make sense if it was already very bright cells to get a plus 10. But so you might max out at like a mem plus 5 even if you had fairly bright cells as your reference, compared to something that was mem plus 1 that would only be a little bit brighter than the reference. Okay. If you choose reference as mem, then it's a much more direct scale, like just moving across your intensity scale of like less bright to bright. Okay. All right. So I am going to pick a population, cool, that has some things that I'd like to forward propagate, some t-SNE1, t-SNE2 kind of stuff here. I am going to embed. Actually, I should go, no, whatever, it's fine. Down to which parameters do I want to propagate? Let's pick those 2 t-SNE parameters. And then what is fair for the algorithm to use for calculating what is similar? Let us pick essentially all the compensated parameters. But very much like when I was looking at what I cared about mem, I don't think I want to include live dead, and I don't want to include my dump channel because I already know everything in here is the same because I've gated things out that were positive for the dump channel or positive for the live dead marker. Okay, do I want the input and output quality scores? Yes, I do. What is the number of nearest neighbors I want to calculate? We've got it set to 7 right now, as I mentioned, as the default. We started with 3. We felt like it was a little over-reliant on the single maximum neighbor. It's up to you. It should be a number. I think it shouldn't be any bigger than 7. If you want to make it a little smaller, that's probably okay. Somewhere between 3 and 7 is probably good. We'll play with that a little more and learn from time. You've got a few different distance functions for how do you measure what things are nearest neighbors. We recommend Manhattan. It's computationally fast. Search function, we can do a few varieties, but I think the defaults are pretty good here. And here's the 4 cells to be placed in a cluster button. If we were looking at a particular clustering parameter, let us hit accept, and then that will say ready to drag. And let's see. I want to drag that to, we could go to like lin minus over there in the original files. And that is going to calculate. I realize now that I've just done that a couple of those are going to be the files that I generate on, so they'll be silly. So we won't look at, patient 1 because it'll be making an embed of itself. We will look at patient 2 and just see how those come out. So there you go. When it finishes up on a file, you see the new parameters getting produced, the input quality and the output quality being produced. And those are the things that we will work with. And of course, the first one I picked randomly was one that I don't want to look at, the patient ID 1. All right, finish up with a patient 82, and we will move on with this demo. I should mention also that you can drop it, as I've done, to a specific population. So I've dropped it on the negative. I don't really care about the things upstream of it. Cool. It'll just give a -1 score to everything that I did not bother to actually apply it to. All right. Of course, it picked patient ID 1, and patient ID 1 is the first two things to work on, but there we go. We finally got a patient ID 2 going. Nice. I can go to lin negative population over here. I want to minimize the screen. There, stretch this out beyond my zoom controls so that I can move it. There we go. And let's do input quality and output quality just to see what that looks like. Okay. Just a note, we by default include that -1 region for things that were off, not included in the population. If you want to immediately, if you're working on just the things that you've worked on, switch this to go from 0 to whatever the max is, you can do that. So that's cool. And so maybe I will put in something like that to get the bulk of the cells that have good quality. And we can just compare the differences and see if it actually makes a difference on this one or not. Playing around with this, I have found that sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. Like if your data files are all pretty similar, like you've treated things the same, these are files that were collected on the same day, that it probably won't make too much of a difference. If you really are feeding data that has a lot of like novel populations in it that aren't well modeled, then it may matter a lot more. So we can look at this and go to our embed t-SNE scores, t-SNE 1, t-SNE 2. Okay. And so I've picked a stimulated population. If you remember from our examination here, the unstim population was this, this big guy right there. The more stimulated ones were down here, and there's a mix of things in there. So that is reassuring to look at that plot, which is now behind this one, and say, okay, so the population that's missing is in this stimulated file is the one that disappears during stimulation. So cool, that makes sense. And we've got a little bit of everything else. And then we can look at the better quality one to see if it cleans it up at all and remove some of the stranding of, hey, here's a bunch of things with similar nearest neighbors. Oh, that was input quality. I wanted to t-SNE 2. Boom. Okay, so a little cleaner. This sort of jagged looking pairwise cell things that actually were the things that didn't really fit particularly well in our model. And that looks good. So we've now got directly comparable dimensionality reduction parameters on a data set that we didn't bother to actually calculate them with at the same time. So I'm really excited for that one. I think that's a tool that will really make using these high dimensional workflows everybody's been producing very actionable, that you can learn something on a pilot experiment, and then just keep forward propagating that knowledge without having to go back and concatenate everything together and produce some kind of giant file. Got a question, can we use embed across data that were collected on different days or different instruments? So great question, Derek. That is why I threw the normalization slide in there. It is possible that you can. If you've got an experiment that you've got really strong protocols and negative is always happening at the same intensity, the linearity is good, the positive is happening about the same intensity and so forth, you probably don't need to normalize. You can go directly to using embed. If that's not the case, particularly different instruments, collaborators, you may need to normalize to make sure the data are on the same scale and then use embed. Okay. So it's a similar story if you're using embed or not, but for like anything that you'd like to do across multiple time points, multiple instruments, etc., you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples and coming up with a similar data range. All right. Okay. That is likely a good place to stop. We'll just point to I want to leave a few minutes for questions, and we're at 5 minutes left. I will just point to, if you want to make your own quad gates super fast, tools and booleans. Stretch it out, has all your new quad gate tools. Where the gist of this is essentially, I guess I can do like a really quick demo on this in a minute, and then still leave a little time for questions. If I have something like, some parameter, I should pick one of my compensated parameters. That would be smart. IL6, that's not very bimodal. Ooh, I'm striking out here. Come on, some bimodal. Ooh, worse. What am I on, a non-stim? Stim. CD14, I think, has got both. Yay. Okay, I will make a range gate. And then I'll pick a different parameter. Hunt around for something else bimodal. Yeah, cool. Some other kind of bifurcator gate. Highlight those bad boys. And let's make a curly quad. Okay. So, great way if you are working with like some cytokines or a bunch of things that you want to look at one at a time, individual expression, and then go back and say, now I'm interested in combos, to quickly turn on the quad gate. Okay. So there's a question on using CyCombine and across different batches. You have to indicate which batch is which much. I think I saw Veronica help out with questions in Spanish before, and if she's still there, I would greatly appreciate some assistance. This one is more than I'm going to handle. And I think I will just point out, while I'm hoping for assistance there, that if you've got different similar branches at different places of a hierarchy, so we'll just drop a couple of gates on different places. This is the spot where you can, I wanted to do a particular selection. You can clone something, clone gates, and they get the little icon so that if you move one of them, I guess I should use this and go up, that the other will adjust as well. That might have been a poor choice of half of a quad. Yeah, I may not be able to move that one. Anyway, that's how you get to clone gates. Thank you, Veronica. Fortuitous that you decided to join today. Okay, I want to just leave the last 2 minutes for any questions. Veronica's answering the one on the chat. Fire away. If you've got questions before this holiday weekend, I'm happy to chit chat about it. If not, enjoy the weekend early. I guess while they're coming in, thank you for some hand clapping. I should mention things like, I pointed at 2 different plugins early on. If you go to plugins, the FlowJo Exchange is the top choice. There's all the plugins. They grow every month. There's always a bunch of new stuff up here. This is actually a real credit to the whole industry, as plugins are essentially our community outreach, where we say, this is where a lot of people are doing really cool work, and we just want to partner up and give you, whoever's using FlowJo, give you the tools that everybody here is working on. And just scrolling down towards some of the newer ones. There is the T-Rex tool, Elastigate, which is a really neat one for figuring out if you've got, 96 files and 96 well played, whatever, you want to make a gate and you want to have that gate automatically adjust to the data for all the rest of the files. Elastigate is cool for that. There's CyCombine, there's the CellView Lens, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where you can get plugins. 10.9 itself is just right off of flowjo.com and downloads. Okay, 10.9's here. So I have a movie somewhere on it that I think will look a lot like this webinar looked. All right, and there's some explanation of what all the tools were. Oh, I should mention too, yeah, I didn't want to take on too much in the webinar, but there are also just some improved interaction with BD Research Cloud. There is just a bunch of places throughout the program where you can open or save something, like import a Diva file, whatever, that we've just added to BD Research Cloud as a choice. BD Research Cloud, a free tool for designing experiments, for designing panels, for storing data online up to a certain point. If you store enough data that it gets expensive for us to store it, then we charge you. Sorry, it's the way the data works. If it gets really big, then it gets really expensive. But other than that, yeah, there's a bunch of interactions that are a little friendlier right now with BDRC because it's available through every open and close. Okay. Thank you again, Veronica. All right, we are at 3:59. If there are no further questions, then we're going to wrap. and say enjoy the holiday weekend.